I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Robin Dines. To my right, Andre Mazzetto. So we're from two of the teams based here at Lincoln. So on behalf of AgResearch, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Madeline from Beef and Lamb here, but also, importantly, Frank Mitloehner. He's a professor and air quality specialist in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. He shares his knowledge and research domestically and abroad with students, scientists, farmers, ranchers, policymakers, and beyond. Sorry, I've just got to go to my next email now. It's so well organised here. As part of his position with UC Davis in the cooperative extension, he collaborates with animal agriculture sector to create better efficiencies and mitigate pollutants. He is passionate about understanding and mitigating air emissions from livestock operations, as well as studying the implications of these emissions on the health of farm workers and neighbouring communities. In addition, he's focusing on the food production challenge that will become global issues as the world's population grows to nearly 10 billion by 2050. Frank received a Master of Science degree in Animal Science and Agricultural Engineering from the University of Leipzig in Germany, and a doctoral degree in Animal Science from Texas Tech. Frank was recruited to UC Davis back in 2002 to fill its first ever position focusing on the relationship between livestock and air quality. Frank, welcome.
Good morning, everybody. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. I thank you very much for the introduction, Robin. Thank you for New Zealand Beef and Lamb for inviting me, and for this beautiful campus here to host me today. So I've been in this field for a while. I'm an air quality specialist, so I study the impacts animal agriculture has on air quality and on climate, and particularly ways to minimize those contributions. And I've done this for a couple of decades now, and I'm very interested in sharing some of the experiences with you today. When you think of California, what comes to mind? What do you think of when you think of California? Not the US, I know what you think of when you think of the US. But when you think of California, what do you think of?
Sunshine.
Sunshine. Okay, and surfing, yeah. How about Silicon Valley? You probably think of that. How about Hollywood? You might think of that. But do you think of agriculture when you think of California?
Yep.
If you don't, you should. Because California is by far the strongest agricultural state within the United States. Twice as strong as the number 2, and that's Iowa. We are producing 50% of all fruits and vegetables in the United States, in California. 20% of all dairy products, 90% of all nuts. So it's a very strong agricultural powerhouse. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because we have that in common with New Zealand. We also have in common with New Zealand that we have strong environmental pressures, and that we have to figure out how to make everything work. Rural, urban communities on the one side, ecological pressures on the other side, and fitting all of that into an economy that thrives. So I'm here today not to tell you what to do at all. I'm not here to lecture you. In fact, I have many colleagues here who are first-class, top-notch scientists, recognized throughout the world, particularly in the area of climate and agriculture. But I'm here to share some of our experiences with you because we have different policy approaches in California, some of which might be of interest to you here. So I already mentioned that we have similarities. This, by the way, is not a California animal. This is a Texan animal, but I love it so much. Let me see how I advance this. So, what you see on this slide, does anybody know what this is?
California.
This is California, a little bit tilted. So this here is the Bay Area. This is San Francisco. Sacramento over here. This is where I live, in Davis, right between Sacramento and San Francisco. This is the Napa Valley here. Down here, not on the screen, is LA. California is home to close to 40 million people. 40. So it's the #1 most populous state in the United States. It keeps being popular, and that means more and more people want to move into California. But the places where they traditionally moved into, and that's largely Southern California, those places are largely filled to the hilt. And that means people who are interested in living in California now more and more often move into areas that are traditionally agricultural. Okay, that's one thing that I want to share with you right from the start. Another one is that most of agriculture happens right here in this very large valley. It's called the Great Central Valley of California. It has excellent soil, excellent growth conditions, a lot of sunshine, so you can grow anything, and we do. Grow 400 specialty crops, pretty much anything you can think of other than soy, wheat. We don't grow that stuff. That's not expensive enough. But almonds and walnuts and olives and garlic and you name it, everything is grown here. So you also see some mountain ranges here. This is the Sierra Nevada, the highest mountain range in California. On the other side here you have the coastal mountain range, and both of these mountain ranges surround the Great Central Valley where most of the agriculture takes place. And the topography is one of the reasons as to why our air quality is such a challenge. The location in the United States with the worst air quality is right here, Fresno in California. The number 2 is Los Angeles. The number 3 is Houston, Texas. And one of the reasons why this area is so poor with respect to air quality is topography. Any kind of air pollution that's either produced in here or that's coming in from outside, from this direction here, stays there because of the topography, okay, in this large trough. And because of that, there's a lot of focus on the contribution of agriculture to air quality, because this is what's happening in this valley here, largely agriculture. Okay? So our farmers also experience a lot of environmental pressures on air quality, on climate, as well as on water quality. And that is probably what our agricultural sector is most limited of, a reliable water supply. Okay? So, just to give you an idea, obviously everybody here knows our dairies are not like your dairies, but dairy in California is the #1 livestock production. But our dairies look differently. Our cows are largely not on pasture. They are in barns. This is first of all where the dry cows are housed, so animals not lactating are in dry lot corrals, not on pasture as I said. The lactating cows are largely housed in free stalls. You see here a roof, you don't see side walls, they're always naturally ventilated. The animals have their own beds, they're so-called freestall beds, and that's why the barns are called freestall barns. And the manure falls off the cow onto concrete and is flushed from that concrete lane into what's called a lagoon. So you can see it's sizably different from what you do here. And what we call a lagoon is not what you probably think of when you think of a lagoon. This is not a blue lagoon, it's a brown lagoon. 98% though of that lagoon is water, and 2% are solids. Okay, and the solids is what the manure makes up. And it is that lagoon that's the #1 source of methane, and that's what I will mainly talk about here today. And the other main source is enteric emissions, that's what animals belch out. And while I believe that we should not have a myopic focus on one greenhouse gas, such as methane, it is a very important one, and oftentimes I at least consider it as the Achilles heel of animal agriculture. Okay? The methane issue is very important to animal agriculture, and getting it right is so important because it is such a critical greenhouse gas. So that's why I'm focusing my remarks today on methane, but I want to acknowledge that all of my research always includes the other environmental categories as well. Reactive nitrogen, for example, because the nitrogen that animals excrete can become ammonia. It can also become nitrate, a groundwater pollutant. It can become nitrous oxide. It can also become an environmentally benign nitrogen gas. Depending upon how we manage that nitrogen, it can go one way or another. But I will not talk about nitrogen today. I just want to acknowledge that my research is not just on methane, but because it's so important in this context here, much of what I will talk about is on methane. So, last not least, that's my last icebreaker slide, is this one here. This is one of my favorite slides. It shows a fence line. On the left side of the fence is a California dairy with 1,000 California cows. On the right side of the fence is a recently built urban encroachment. There are 1,000 cows here, there are 1,000 new homes here, and these 1,000 homes there come with 2,000 adults plus kids and so on. Why do you think that people move there, this close to a dairy? I'm sorry?
Affordability.
Affordability, exactly, because the land was relatively cheap. That's why they moved there. From places outside California most often, into the agricultural area and then smack right next to those farms. And so, yes, they moved there because the land was relatively cheap. What do you think was the first thing they did after they moved there? They complained, I'm being more diplomatic here. They complained, some people think, no, in California you don't complain, you sue. So these people moved there, and the first thing they did was sue this farm. And when it comes to court of laws, you can imagine who most times wins. Because you have a lot more taxpayers and voters and so on this side of the fence compared to that side of the fence. And most often then the farmers pack up and leave. And this is a scenario where the farmers cannot win. This is an example of terrible land use planning. This should never happen. But I see it happen everywhere, not just in California. I was in Colombia not long ago. I saw the same thing in Colombia. And I saw it all over the world. I do travel a lot, and I travel with very wide open eyes, and it really breaks my heart, because I truly believe that we need to have a strong agricultural sector in just about any country in the world, because they are so strategically important to our societies. What is more important than the health sector and the food sector of any economy in the world? I can't think of anything as important. But instead of working with farmers to getting things managed and organized and work seamless, oftentimes I see this ag-urban conflict, and that breaks my heart. And it should break all of our heart. And we should work really strongly in overcoming these divides. And I feel, as you can tell, passionate about it. It should never happen. But when it happens, the farmer loses. I will not talk about this type of situation here where issues arise that we call nuisances. Nuisances are odors, flies, dust. Okay, these are the things that get farmers into trouble with neighbors. I will not talk about that today, but I will talk about greenhouse gases and in particular methane today. This is now a very simplistic depiction of how greenhouse gases affect warming. Okay, so you see here the sun radiating down solar beams to the surface of the Earth. Normally they would be reflected back into space if there weren't this blanket of greenhouse gases, of which there are several, retaining some of the solar heat in our atmosphere. Okay, so without greenhouse gases, we know life on Earth would not be possible. It would be too cold. So we do need some greenhouse gases, but the issue around warming and greenhouse gases is that human activity is producing just simply too many of those. And that makes this blanket, this greenhouse gas blanket, too thick, meaning too much heat is retained in our atmosphere. And that leads to the warming effect. Some of you might see, well, we have CO2 here, we have methane, we have nitrous oxide. Nothing new, these are the three main ones that are oftentimes discussed. Some people say, well, why is there not water vapor on that slide? Isn't water vapor also an important greenhouse gas? Yes, it is. But human activity does not in any major way affect the water balance in our atmosphere with respect to changing water vapor in any major way. And that's why it's not of concern to regulatory agency, to most other agencies. Those things that happen naturally, like volcanoes and oceans and wild animals like antelope and bison and so on, are not really in our control. And so because of that, they are not really falling into inventories of human activity. So I will not talk about that. I will talk about methane in particular. While most scientists will tell you the most important greenhouse gas from human activity is CO2 as a result of burning fossil fuel, which is oil, coal, and gas. there are folks who say, well, we should really have a focus on methane because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas. And this is what some of the discussion is about. It's true, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. If you believe this matrix GWP 100, then one molecule of methane would be approximately 28 times more powerful than a molecule of CO2, and nitrous oxide even more so, 265 times more potent. And that's where the notion comes from, that anything that produces methane must be strongly controlled or taken out of human activity. So there are people who go as far as to say, we should just change what we eat. No more animal source foods in our diet. We've all heard this, right? So and then the question is that true? Would a change of our diet really change humans' impact on climate in any major way? These are questions that people ask me. High school students, chefs, dietitians, nutritionists, judges. I talk to all these different audiences because the public wants to know what's real and what's not real, and I'm doing my best to address that. This matrix here, GWP 100, has come under criticism in recent years because it's believed by many as being too simplistic. As a matrix that simply says methane is 28 times more powerful, as if it were a CO2 on steroids. Okay, as if you simply have to multiply this gas times 28 and then you know what its warming impact is. But it's not that simple. Methane has more depth to it than the other gases, CO2 and nitrous oxide. And what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at this global methane budget. Methane globally is produced by various sources, and there are a few listed here: fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, and that's what we focus on today. Agriculture being a main source of methane, and here in particular those anaerobic sources like a rumen of a cow or a sheep or a goat, as well as a rice paddy and so on. Those things are agricultural sources. Biomass burning, wetlands and so on. All of these are sources of methane, and these sources of methane globally amount to a total, and you see the half bubble there, of almost 560 teragrams. That's how much methane is produced by all the sources in the world. And here's where oftentimes the discussion on methane ends, when indeed it shouldn't end there, because methane is more complex, as I said. It does not have sources associated with it, but there are sinks. And the sinks are depicted on this side here as amounting, you see the second half bubble, to almost 550 teragrams, meaning 560 are produced by sources, but 550 are destroyed by sinks. And if you want to know what the net is, then you have to subtract the one from the other. And that's very often not done in the public discourse around this gas. Now you will ask, well, what is it that is such a major sink of methane? You see this large area here pointing downward. Underneath it says sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And that refers to the fact that there is an oxidative process that destroys methane, and that happens roughly within a decade. Roughly within a decade, a so-called radical, it's called a hydroxyl radical, oxidizes a methane molecule, and the methane molecule is gone. Not gone, it's converted back to CO2 and to water. And that takes roughly, as I said, about a decade. And because of that, because of the fact that methane is oxidized, so to say, destroyed, it's referred to as a short-lived climate pollutant. Okay. The other ones are long-lived climate pollutants, like CO2 and nitrous oxide, but methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. Now you will ask, is that just an academic discussion? Do we need to know this? Yes, you do need to know that. Because if you don't know that, you will not understand why this gas is so different. So, take-home message, methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It's not just produced, it's also destroyed. The other ones, nitrous oxide and CO2, are not destroyed in the atmosphere, but they stay there for a long time. Because of the fact that methane is not just produced but also destroyed, it has that short lifespan. There are different numbers you find in the literature, anywhere between 9 and 12 years, most people would agree upon. CO2, once it's in the atmosphere, will stay there for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years. Pretty much forever. That means anytime you've ever driven a car or flown someplace, the burning of the fossil fuel involved puts CO2 into the atmosphere, and all of that is still there. The CO2 from today, from last week, last month, last year, from the entire lifespan, all that CO2 is still in the atmosphere, as well as the stuff your parents and grandparents and so on put in there. And it will pretty much stay in there forever. And that means that while one molecule of CO2 is less potent in heating up our planet, it lingers around forever. And that's a big deal. Now, methane is more potent per molecule, but it's also of shorter lifespan, as you can see here. And nitrous oxide, the third greenhouse gas that's for some reason not very often talked about, is both very potent and it's long-lived. Okay, so in my opinion, nitrous oxide does not really get the attention it deserves, and particularly by those who are very anti-animal agriculture. From those I always hear the methane discussion, okay? So, and today we'll talk about, is that warranted? To what extent is it warranted? Should we be radical about shutting down all methane sources and so forth? Because that's the kind of discussion that I hear. This slide is a slide that confuses people no end. And that is why it's very important that you listen to the nuances, okay? And if you have any questions, please ask. It describes the so-called biogenic carbon cycle. The methane from livestock is called biogenic methane. And that's different from fossil methane, okay? Biogenic methane is a cyclical kind of, has a cyclical path, and I will explain that briefly. Chemically, methane is CH4, and the C in CH4 is the carbon, and we now look at where that carbon that makes it into methane that our animals belch out, or that is produced by their manure, where that carbon comes from. It originates from atmospheric CO2. Atmospheric CO2 during photosynthesis is taken on by the plants that our animals eat. The CO2 goes into those plants and is then converted into either cellulose or into starch, depending upon what plants we're talking about, carbohydrates. In the rumen of those animals, the carbon from those carbohydrates is then partly converted into methane. Is the carbon in this methane new to our atmosphere? No, it's not new to our atmosphere. It was in our atmosphere before, but in a different form, in the form of CO2. So this carbon is not new to our atmosphere, okay? But while it's in the atmosphere as methane, it's warming our planet, okay? I want to be very clear, what I'm showing you here does not vindicate the importance of methane. While this gas is in the atmosphere in the form of methane, it warms up our planet. It does so for approximately a decade. But after that period of time, it's oxidized into CO2 again. And it's these radicals, these so-called hydroxyl radicals, that do that trick, okay? Now you might ask, Frank, you just told us methane is a short-lived climate pollutant, CO2 is a long-lived climate pollutant. Isn't that a bad thing, that it goes back to CO2? Well, it's not a good or bad thing. It's a thing, yes, but is that CO2 new to the atmosphere? No, that CO2 is definitely not new to the atmosphere, because at the beginning of the biogenic carbon cycle, it was already in that form, in that very same form. So the biogenic carbon cycle describes where the carbon comes from, where it's going, and while it's cyclical, while the carbon goes around and around and around, while it's in this form, it's a problem, okay? But overall, a constant, and that's important, a constant source of methane, like a constant cattle herd, for example, does not add additional carbon to the atmosphere, does not add additional warming to our planet. If you reduce 0.3% of methane per year, 0.3% of methane per year, then you're not adding additional warming to the planet. And that is what makes methane so different from CO2. The best analogy I can give you with respect to how CO2 differs from methane is one of a bathtub, and I'll get to that in a minute. So imagine you have a bathtub that has a faucet, but it does not have a drain. If you turn the faucet on low, on medium, or high, then water goes into the bathtub and the water levels do what? They go up. They can only go up. There's no drain in that bathtub. And that's what CO2 does. Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add additional warming to our planet, depending on how much we crank up the fossil fuel burning. The methane analogy bathtub is a bathtub that has a faucet, but it also has a drain, and the drain is always open. The drain stands for the oxidation of this gas. If you turn the faucet on normal, then an equal amount of water that goes in is let go of through the drain. What does the water level do as a result? It stays stable, because the same amount of water we put in is let go of through the drain. What happens if we put that faucet on low, but the drain is open? Then we replenish less water than we let go of. And then what happens to the water level? The water level goes down. If we, however, crank that faucet up all the way, then we put more water into the bathtub than it's letting it go off, and then the water levels will rise. And that's what we certainly don't want to do. And that is what we are currently doing globally, okay? Even in the livestock sector, globally methane is going up. And that's largely the result of what's happening in the developing world, where increasing demand for nutrient-dense food is causing livestock herds to grow, and that increases methane. And that's something that's a serious issue we need to address. But in most developed countries, it's not happening because livestock herds are pretty stable, and or producers are already mitigating at scale. And I will show you one example from the place where I live and work. So, is this similar or different from what happens to fossil methane and fossil carbon in general? Well, I would say it is different. First of all, what are fossil fuels? These are oil, coal, and gas. They used to be plants and animals such as dinosaurs. They lived, died, decayed, fossilized, and accumulated underground for hundreds of millions of years. Until 70 years ago, humans extracted those fossil fuels and we started burning them. So the carbon that was stored underground for hundreds of millions of years is now extracted at rapid scale and speed. And where does that carbon that was down there for so long, where's it now? It's there. I see fingers pointing up. Exactly. So what was down there for so long is now put up there, and it's warming the planet. That is not a short-lived cycle, but it's a one-way street of carbon from the bottom up into the air. And I would show you one more slide contrasting these two. The fossil carbon on the one side on the left, where you have ancient carbon that was in the ground for a very long time. We're extracting it. We are burning it with cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, and so on. And by doing so, we are taking carbon, putting it from the ground into the atmosphere. And every time we do it, we warm our planet in an additional fashion. Now, on the right side here, you see the biogenic carbon cycle, where you have atmospheric CO2, which during photosynthesis makes it into the feed plants that our animals eat. Some of that carbon stays above ground, and that's what our animals eat. But the majority of the carbon these plants take on goes below ground into the roots. And from the roots, that carbon is taken on by soil microbes, a process referred to as soil carbon sequestration. And that's a big deal here in New Zealand. And there's a lot of controversy over how much of that soil carbon sequestration is happening here in New Zealand, as opposed to other parts of the world. Yes?
Why is photosynthesis not considered a sink for carbon dioxide?
Photosynthesis is not considered because it is not a net addition. So if you are exhaling CO2 right now, why are you not considered a greenhouse gas emission source, you might ask? The reason is because you've had something for breakfast and for dinner last night. And what you're exhaling right now was previously taken on by the things you ate. Those plants that you ate during their lifetimes had taken carbon out of the air. Now you're eating these plants and you're putting the carbon back into the air. So what the plants had taken out, you're putting back in. So that's a wash. Okay, that's a wash. The same thing with livestock. What they expire with respect to CO2 is not considered a contribution to greenhouse gas emissions because they're eating plants that had previously assimilated that carbon, and that's why it's a wash.
Excuse me.
Yes.
But we're also carrying out respiration.
Yeah, respiration is largely not considered for that reason, because what we are respiring is something that has relatively, in a short period before that we are respiring, taken on that carbon out of the atmosphere, from the atmosphere. So it is this very short exchange from plants that had taken carbon out of the air. They make that carbon into carbohydrates. We are eating those carbohydrates, and we are respiring CO2, putting the CO2 back into the air. But what we are putting into the air is not a net addition of new carbon, because we're eating those plants. It's a wash. But just to complete this, soil carbon sequestration is hotly contested here in this country. There are some people who say your grazing systems here sequester a lot, and others who say, no, our soils here in your soils here in New Zealand are so rich that they're already almost saturated with carbon and will not sequester a lot more additional carbon. So there's a lot of discussion, and I will not opine one way or the other because I'm not from here, but I just want to say that there's a lot of discussion. Our animals eat above ground vegetation and therefore above ground stored carbon. Some of the methane that's produced in the animal is then belched out, and that belched out methane is then converted back to where it came from. I think everybody here sees the difference between biogenic carbon on the one side versus fossil carbon on the other side. This is a one-way street, this is a cycle. Okay. While it's methane in the atmosphere, it's not different. The methane in the atmosphere from fossil versus the methane in the atmosphere from biogenic is the same. But in the one case, you always add new additional carbon. In the other case, you have a cycling of carbon.
Excuse me, just on the soil sequestration,
Yes.
There's a lot of arguments about the percentage of carbon and release and various activities, but we never seem to talk about soil formation. And you know, we're observing significant soil formation and over shorter periods of time.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, when you think about the cow eats 15 tonnes of dry matter and it poops it out, and that's starting to form, it's increasing the layers of soil. So
Yeah.
is there anyone looking at that, or is it not really?
I'm sure people are looking at it. I bet you're asking the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that quite frankly. If something is out of my area of expertise, and soil sciences is out of my area of expertise, I will readily acknowledge that. I do know that soils build very slowly, but agriculture does build soils. Agriculture also depletes soils, depending on how you treat soils, whether you are kind or not so kind with the soils. You'll do either a very good job building additional carbon, or you're depleting it. But this is a slippery slope that I'm not willing to go on. So,
Question on the Paris Accord is a gross emissions framework. Why has it ignored your cycle in the methane cycle process?
they do not ignore that. They also describe biogenic carbon as opposed to fossil carbon. It's not ignored. But the reason why I even bring this up is because I just want to say they are different. While the methane is in the atmosphere, it's in both cases doing the same thing to warming. But the question is always, what happens when we have a constant methane source versus we reduce methane or we increase methane over time? How will that affect our environment? And I will get to that in a few slides. And I think this is a really important discussion. One that you have had here ad nauseam in New Zealand, and one that's critically important. In fact, you are world leading here in New Zealand having that discussion, namely having as a target a warming approach as opposed to just counting carbon emissions. I will get to that in a minute. To some of you that might be abstract, and to others an old hat, but it's an important part of the discussion. What you see on this slide here is a stock gas, that's what we call it, CO2. If you live 20 miles or 20 kilometers away from work and you drive on Monday, then you put CO2 into the air. On Tuesday you drive again, you put new additional CO2 into the air. in and above the stuff from the previous day. On Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, anytime you drive, you add to the existing stock of what you put into the air the previous day, the previous week, the previous month, and so on. Because of that, because of the fact that CO2 is a accumulating gas, it's called a stock gas. Okay? Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add additional warming to our planet. Either a little bit or a lot, but it's always new and additional. Currently, many people in many places in the world treat methane as if it were a stock gas as well. But methane is not a stock gas. Methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And that means if you have a constant source of methane, then almost an equal amount of what's produced is also being destroyed through hydroxyl oxidation. And that means, let's say you've always had 100 head of dairy or beef operation. In 1980, in 1990, in 2000, 2010, you still have 100 cows today. Constant source of methane would mean that the methane these animals have put out and the methane that was destroyed through hydroxyl oxidation are roughly in balance, meaning they're not causing additional warming. They're causing warming, but no additional warming. If you increase your herd size from 100 to 150, then you are increasing methane in the atmosphere. If you, with your 100 head dairy or beef operation, use some kind of mitigation and you reduce methane over time, then you're doing what I described with this bathtub analogy. You're turning that faucet on low. And then you are reducing methane in the atmosphere. And ladies and gentlemen, that reduces warming. A reduction of methane reduces warming. And that's really important, because what that means is that methane could be a curse or it could be a blessing, depending upon how you manage it. If you stick your head in the sand, you say, I don't believe in any of that. I do whatever I want to do. I grow methane if I so wish. If you do that, you're part of the problem. If you manage methane, then you will be part of the solution because of its short-lived nature. So this is CO2, flow gas, methane. If you have a constant source of methane, you're not adding additional methane concentration, you're not adding additional warming to our planet. And I have two kind of technical slides on this. No, I'm not going into all of that. But I'm going into this here real quick. So, because it shows how important it is to do what you do here in New Zealand. So imagine two sources, a power plant and a cattle herd, over 30 years grow in emissions. The power plant produces more and more power, and as a result produces way more and more CO2 over time. That increasing amount of CO2 leads to an exponential increase in the related warming. If you have a also linear increase of methane, let's say you grow your cattle herd from 100 to 150 to 200 over 30 years, then that linear increase of methane also will increase the warming caused by that methane. If you hold both the power plant emission and the resulting CO2 constant, as well as the methane from the cattle herd, then the constant amount of CO2 will still lead to increasing warming from that CO2 because this gas accumulates. But if you have a constant cattle herd, then you produce a constant amount of warming. Okay, you can already see that these two gases behave differently with respect to how they warm the planet. And the third scenario, I think, is the most important one. What happens if this power plant, if the owners decide after 30 years of producing power, we are shutting it down because we want to go to net zero emissions? Then only at the time that you go to net zero CO2 emissions, the warming from that CO2 will plateau. Until then, the reduction of CO2 will still cause increasing warming. And that is what makes CO2 so troublesome. Any amount of CO2 we put in the air will cause additional warming. And if we want to stop additional warming, we have to stop the burning of fossil fuels. For livestock and other methane sectors, it's different. If we reduce methane, we reduce warming. If we reduce methane, we reduce warming. And that's actually a big deal. On the previous slide here, I want to show you that really quickly. You see a comparison of two matrices if you increase methane, if you hold it steady, or if you decrease methane, has different impacts on warming. And if you just focus on the right side here for a second, if you increase methane over 30 years, you will increase a lot of warming. Okay, we don't want to get there, but that's happening in certain parts of the world. If we hold stable or slightly reduce methane over 30 years, then we do not cause additional warming. In fact, if we reduce methane, then we reduce warming. That's negative warming. The negative sign in front of the number means negative warming. If we reduce methane by a lot, let's say 35% over 20, 30 years, then we are pulling a lot of methane out of the atmosphere, and that reduces warming. Now the question I have is, can we in agriculture reduce methane by that much and have this kind of effect on our climate? Can we or can we not?
Frank,
Yes.
what's your baseline for the 35%? Is 2005, 2000, 1500s?
This is a theoretical depiction, but it is using GWP star and a 20-year time frame actually. Assuming that a 0.3% reduction of this gas will pretty much get us here to this point. No additional warming.
But then what should be our baseline then? Because then GWP star depends on your reference, right?
It depends. The answer to that is it depends. If you are in New Zealand, you have a few years different time reference as we do in California, or some people use 1990, some people use 2005, 2013, 2017. Whatever it is, the idea is of about 20 years, a 30% reduction would really mean a very significant reduction of warming to an extent where that industry does not cause additional warming to our atmosphere.
Further question to that. What if you were to take that baseline back to like 1800?
Well, of course we can do all of that. We can do all of that. We can go back to 1800 or back to the Stone Ages. But it's not relevant from a regulatory perspective, from a policy perspective. It's as little relevant as saying, well, how about the bisons some 300 years ago in the United States? You had 100 million large ruminants then. Today you still have 100 million large ruminants. Doesn't that mean we don't have to worry about it today? It doesn't mean that. Because those domestic livestock herds we have today are under our control, and we can manipulate whether they produce a lot or little of that gas. Okay, so we always have to think about not just some intellectual mind games or so, but what's policy relevant? What's policy relevant? What can we influence through policies and assist in our research, for example? Okay.
Isn't the total number of ruminant animals relevant to that discussion?
Yeah, you can have that discussion. So, for example, we used to have 60 million bison and 40 million large antelope back 250 years ago in the United States. It's 100 million large ruminants. Today we have 90 million beef and 9 million dairy cows. Again, 100 million large ruminants. So some people say, well, why even worry? We always had a lot of methane coming from large ruminants. That's true, but it doesn't really matter because when it comes to emission inventories, we are dealing with human-caused contributions and how to reduce those. Acknowledging that we can't really deal with these natural things such as volcanoes or oceans or swamps or wildlife. I mean, we cannot just shoot down every antelope today to reduce our impact on climate, and we're not going to. So, but one can have these discussions, but they're not really getting us anywhere, okay? That's not how reality works. So, can we afford to deal with a reduction of consumption? There are people out there, and they are very heavily supported by much of the mainstream media, unfortunately, who say we need to stop eating animal source foods, and that is the number one or the most important lever that we have. Just change what we eat, and that will have a great impact on our climate. Is that likely to happen? How is it going at places where it's promoted and so on? First of all, this here shows that this is consumption, demand for animal products. You see in different parts of the world where the trajectory goes. it is predicted to increase in most parts of the world, except for Europe and this part of the world here, where demand is relatively stable. But in particularly developing countries, demand for animal source foods is going up, and very much so. This is human population development by 2050. You see here Southeast Asia, and particularly Africa, are believed to grow significantly with respect to human population. The Americas are relatively stable, and Europe will slightly shrink. To give you an idea, I'm in my mid-50s. When I was a little boy, there were 3 billion people in the world. Today there are 8. And by the time I'm an old man, there will be 9.5 billion people in the world. Meaning there will be a tripling of human population on our planet during my lifetime. Tripling. But there will not be a tripling of natural resources to feed these people. And what does that do to our food supply? You have to ask yourself. There are some people in Davis, where I live, or elsewhere, who say we should just go back to the 1950s, 1960s, Red Barn, everybody is out there producing a little bit, just enough, and our farmers are still doing the hand milking and so on. It's not going to happen. This is not how we will feed 3 times more people on our planet during our lifetime. In fact, we will have to do in agriculture what we've done in other parts of the economy, and that is use technologies, knowledge, efficiencies in order to produce the food that humanity needs. If we don't, then we will eat in all of those remaining natural spaces that we seek to protect, such as natural forests and so on. If we seek to protect them, then we need to use our agricultural land to the best of our knowledge. And that's what I will talk about here today. So, this here is one of my favorite slides. It shows the world from space and a circle over Southeast Asia. And that circle here contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside the circle than outside the circle. And they are right at your doorstep. And that means they are your market. Just to exemplify the importance of livestock in our food system, I want to show you a simple depiction. Okay? So imagine this sheet of paper here being the entire surface of the world. This is everything. I now fold this sheet of paper, and I will fold it twice, until it's roughly the size of a postcard. What you see now is the total amount of land in the world. The difference between the large sheet and this is water and ice. This is all the land in the world. And to give you an idea of agricultural land, this is my business card, and the size of my business card is all the agricultural land in the world. So this is all the land in the world, and this is all the agricultural land in the world. And I'll take my business card and I fold it into one piece that's 2/3 and one that's 1/3. And then I rip my own business card into pieces. That's all the agricultural land in the world. The 2/3 piece is all the agricultural land in the world that's considered marginal agricultural land. That's land where you can't grow crops, such as grains or nuts or so. Marginal agricultural lands are used to grow what? Forages. And so who makes use of these forages to produce human food? Ruminant livestock. They are the only ones who can make use of this marginal land. Nobody else can, because ruminant animals are the only ones who can convert the world's #1 most abundant biomass, and that's cellulose. Nobody else can but ruminants. Without ruminants, we could not make use of 2/3 of all agricultural land in the world. That's how important they are. That's the role they play. And now remember, we have a tripling of human population, okay? So this is a big deal. The remainder 1/3 of my business card here is all the arable land. That's where you can grow crops. So that's how limited we are. And that's why it's so important that we use not just crops and so on, but also, of course, livestock. Here, because in the interest of time, and show you some of the things that are circulated currently internationally. One of them being a report that came out by the United Nations FAO. This is a QR code. If you take a photo of this, it will get you to the report. It's called Pathways Toward Lower Emissions. And it shows what the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, suggests we should do to minimize the environmental footprint, particularly the carbon footprint of livestock. They are proposing, and I support that, a toolbox approach, saying there should not be one method, but there should be a toolbox of methods that farmers can pick from in order to get us to reduce emissions. The FAO says currently livestock globally has this kind of emissions associated with it. By 2050 we will have this much of additional emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, added to the livestock sector, so that by 2050 we have a total of this third column here globally. And the FAO says this is way too much. And the FAO says we have a projected goal which is here. We will be here with business as usual if we don't mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane. But we want to be here globally. So they are now explaining how to get from here to there. And this report I just alluded to describes it in detail. These are all steps they say we can take in order to reduce the impact of livestock on climate. The number one they say is this one, productivity increases. The number two they say is this one, breeding. The number three they say is improved animal health. And if you look at all these steps, you will find that none of this is new to you, okay? You are actually world class in the use of most of these tools. In fact, much of the research that was done here in this country has identified some of these very important tools. And your farmers are using them. The FAO is oftentimes asked, well, why don't we just, instead of focusing on agriculture, why don't we just focus on consumption? Just eat less animal source food. So they looked into that as well. What would happen if we were to stop eating animal source food such as meat, dairy, eggs? How much emission reductions would that generate? And they simulated it, and that's the fourth column here. Dietary change in developed countries would lead to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but it would be the second least effective way of getting the carbon footprint down. So what we read a lot in the media is not what's actually happening. If you were to have a meatless Monday in the United States today, 330 million Americans not eating animal source foods one day a week, we would reduce the carbon footprint of the country by 0.3%. 0.3%. The flight I just did to come and visit you generates about 16 tons of CO2. Okay, they are on my carbon mark sheet. I would have to go vegan for 2 years to offset that one flight to New Zealand. I promise you I will not do that, but that's what I would have to do if I would try to make this change through dietary changes. So it's not likely that these dietary changes will actually happen, okay? But they are promoted pretty loudly out there. This here is a report that two of my colleagues and I have written. It's called Meeting the Call, about what's going on in California. And I want to give you a couple of slides to show you what we have done in the state of California to address methane emissions in particular. Okay? We have the world's most aggressive goal to reduce methane, and it is described by a law called SB 1383. Our dairies, our livestock, our agricultural sector needs to reduce methane by 40% by the year 2030. And at first our farmers just couldn't believe that something that of that magnitude was thrown at them. What's very interesting to me is that this law here was not following the usual approach, which I call the Kane approach, of using rules, regulations, fines, and/or taxes to force farmers to reduce emissions, but the legislature decided to go a different route. Use the carrot approach of incentivizing reductions of emissions. I know that could be a curse word here in New Zealand, I hear. Some people don't like the use of incentives. I like the use of incentives because I know they work. And I will show you how they work. So in California, if you look at all the methane sources in the state, dairy is responsible for almost half of all the methane sources in California. And I know here in in New Zealand, you also have dairy and livestock be a significant methane contributor. But just to give you an idea, it's the same thing in California with respect to this one greenhouse gas. And our dairy sector needs to reduce 7.2 million metric tons. That's an abstract number to most of you, but just remember the number 7.2. That's the goalpost. That's the 40% reduction of methane. Okay, because now I will show you where we are in getting there. So the reductions that we had predicted in this report I just alluded to are in 4 major buckets. The one is a herd size reduction. This herd size reduction is because our productivity is increasing per cow per year. Every year we are producing more milk per cow per year, and that leads to a small shrinkage of our dairy herd by 0.5% annually. That herd size reduction, also called attrition, leads to a reduction of methane, because if you have fewer animals, obviously you have less belching, less manure. That's the range of emission reductions you get just through the productivity increases. Then we have anaerobic digesters. We call them covered lagoons, where you cover the manure storage, and that alone will amount to this amount of methane reduction. Then other manure coverage or manure reduction strategies, they will have a range of reduction here depicted 0.6 to 1.1. And in the near future, we'll have feed additives that dairies and other livestock sectors will roll out that will also have a methane reduction as a result. So that's what we predicted. And very recently, the California Air Resources Board, which is our #1 climate agency, came up with numbers very similar to this. But this was just a prediction. Now we also have measurements. We now have measurements. And these measurements are very accurate because, for example, if you produce biogas, then you meter that biogas because you're selling it. Okay? So you know very precisely how much is produced. So our report suggested that we will not produce 7.2 million metric tons of reductions, but more, 7.6 to 10.6. Depending upon how much feed additives will be used, we will outperform what is expected by our farmers. How? Through a voluntary incentive-based approach. You don't force it down the farmer's throat, but you explain to the farmers what's at stake, how they contribute to emissions, what tools are available to reduce emissions. And then you tell them, if you reduce these emissions, you will be financially incentivized. We have a cap and trade system in California. That means industries that cannot reduce emissions have to pay into an account, and others who can reduce emissions are paid out of that account. So if you reduce emissions, you get paid real dollars. So I assume most people know what a digester is, but for those who don't, you have the manure stored, it's covered with a plastic cover, and the biogas, a mixture of gases, 70% of which is methane, is trapped, and the biogas is cleaned up into clean methane, and that clean methane is then used to go into a pipeline, and from there into vehicles, such as heavy-duty trucks and buses. And that's what that looks like when dairy biogas that's cleaned up is then used to run vehicle fleets. So with this principle here, you reduce emissions on the farm, and you use what used to be a liability, the methane, to be an asset because now it's replacing diesel in the transportation sector. And it generates these so-called low carbon fuel standard credits that the dairies who do this technology will receive. This is another approach here. These are feed additives, some of which are used here in this neck of the wood. Some of them are more effective than others. They are studied heavily. There are also boluses available, especially studied here in New Zealand. A capsule that you lodge in the rumen of the animal, slowly releasing an anti-methanogenic compound. There's breeding available. Methane is a heritable trait. There's a whole list of things that can be done to reduce methane. This here is a slide that shows one very important aspect, namely, what's the bottom line of all of this? If we support reductions of methane financially, how much does it cost? How effective is it? Of all the methane reducing funds spent in California to all sectors of society that produce methane, and that's them, 2% of those total spendings go to the dairy sector. 2%, so a very small amount. But the 2% investment into the dairy sector to reduce methane has caused 30% of statewide methane reductions. Nothing in the state is more cost effective than methane mitigation from dairies. 2% of investment have led to 30% of reductions. Now that has gotten the attention of our regulatory agencies, of our legislature and so on. Namely, that this working with the farmers is highly cost effective. And this is not a subsidy. These farmers, in addition to selling milk, they are now selling biogas. That's a fuel, and that's a new product that they are selling. So where do we stand today? I told you 7.2 million metric tons is the goal. This is how much we have reduced so far. If you add it up, if you add these numbers up, you will arrive at 5 million metric tons. So in 5 years from now, we are supposed to reduce 7.2. Until now, we have reduced 5 million metric tons. And our farmers are not on the streets of Sacramento, our capital, protesting. They are happy with the approach that was used. It works for them. And it has been effective. We did not use the usual we versus them approach, but we worked with the farmers to achieve a measurable outcome. And that, to me, is where it should be. Okay. Depending upon where you stand here, I think, just think about how can you make a system like this work. And I understand how different California is compared to New Zealand. You're not in intensive barns and so on. You have other challenges here with grazing systems. But the general concept is one that should give people pause and make them think. This is, by the way, what a covered lagoon looks like. This one here, you see this bulging out of the plastic that's covering the lagoon. That bulging out here is biogas. 70% of that is methane. That methane is now powering vehicles. So with that, that's my last slide. I'm happy to entertain any questions that you have. Thank you so much for your attention.
Same size as the rooms. So Andre's going to be monitoring those. So if we draw you down, it's just so we can make sure everyone gets a voice. Rebecca, lead the way.
Kia ora, that was a fantastic explanation. Really appreciate you coming all this way, even though it's impacted on your carbon footprint. I just wanted to make a comment. So I'm from Ag Research. So New Zealand, obviously, because we don't have the scale of effluent ponds, but we do have EcoPond here, which is a Ravensdown initiative. Lincoln University did the discovery work, which is a tool that New Zealand farmers can use for a smaller scale reduction of methane in their effluent ponds, which is just something that is available in New Zealand. So just maybe have a look at that while you're here too.
Yep.
That was all, and it was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm aware of it. It's a technology to reduce methane from the lagoon, and I think that's a good intermediate step.
Because of the scale that we have here.
Right.
Yeah.
It's nice to have a technology to reduce methane, but if you can take methane and make it from a problem into a solution, then that's even better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I support both of them, but one a little more than the other.
Yeah.
Stephen.
Hi, Frank. Stephen Wallace, Ag Research. I'm interested if you could comment on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, Forestry, Land and Agriculture Sector Guidance Reduction Targets, which I know take a global perspective, and their sort of credibility, if you like, and what you think about them.
I have to tell you, like I remarked about on the soil side, it's not really my main area, and it gets me onto a slippery slope. So I don't know enough about it to be credible. Okay, so I can't really give you a good answer to this. I know that there's a lot of support, there's a lot of criticism. I have not looked into this enough to have a good answer. Yes?
Do you have views on GWP 100 or GWP star in the Paris Agreement?
Yes. So the world is using GWP 100, a metric that simply says that methane is 28 times the potency of CO2, and it does not acknowledge to its fullest extent the actual behavior of this gas. As I alluded to before, this gas is short-lived, and because of that, it has a unique impact on warming. New Zealand has deployed a split gas approach, meaning they count separately for CO2 and methane, and that's the way to go. Because if you use a matrix like GWP100 or any other matrix, you mix them all together and have some algorithms to figure out how they compare. But better than doing that is to have them separate. Okay? The split gas approach is one that New Zealand is using. Uruguay is using it. I'm hopeful that other places will be as well. If you must use a matrix because you're just that kind of person, then please use one that predicts what we are after. And what we're after, why do we care about greenhouse gases? We don't really care about greenhouse gases because we care about carbon emissions. We care about greenhouse gases because of what? Because of warming. So why not using a metric that describes the effect of an activity on warming? And that's what GWP star does. And that's why that metric is one that's fit for purpose, namely GWP star, and the other one, GWP 100, is not. If one of you here were a dairy farmer wanting to know how does my dairy compare today versus 20 years ago, 40 years ago, how am I doing with respect to my impact on warming? Wouldn't you want to have a metric that describes the actual impact you have on that category, on warming? I think the answer is clearly yes. So I think there's a very clear tendency to it.
Can we just build on that? You've got one coming from online, but just before
Yes.
that, Andre,
Yep.
Frank, one of the things about GWP star
Yes.
is that you do need data over a reasonable length of time. So do you think it's more suited to look across an industry, and it could be challenging for farms at an individual scale?
Any metric can be challenging for an individual farm. If you ask any farmer in the world what his carbon footprint is, they will look at you with their eyes glazed over.
Now, come on, Andre, you might disagree with
Well,
that.
some of you might be elaborate enough to have done the work and so, but the vast majority of farms in the world will not.
I have a comment on that. With regards to nitrate leaching limits in New Zealand, we actually rely on historical data too. It shouldn't be any different from historical data that we could use in methane production.
Certainly when we go out to collect data from farmers, we can really struggle to get data from 20 years ago. Not in all cases, but often the data's not available. Either that's a length of time that you need. Now, Andre, over to what's online.
About methane and the short term. So given that methane can help us reduce warming now, should we not focus on reducing it heavily now? That helps short term, while we cannot get the longer term, and we're working on the longer term for CO2.
Yeah, I think what I just said speaks to that. So I want to be very clear that I, by no ways, are saying we should relax on methane. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying methane must be managed. And once we manage it, we can become part of a climate solution. And we should. We should do our bit to address this overall issue of additional warming. But we also need to be fair. We also need to be fair and make sure that we describe the impact of a sector accurately and that we're not overblowing it. Because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathtub. We want to have a strong agricultural sector that can do its best to minimize its environmental footprint. Right? I think that's what we can all agree upon, regardless of where we come from. That's what we should agree upon. And describing what we do in the most accurate way, I think, makes all the sense in the world. And with respect to your comment on, do we have data from 20 years ago? We don't have detailed geobiochemical data from 20 years ago, from 40 years ago, and so on. But what describes the production of methane the most are animal numbers, feed intake, roughage content, and to some extent fat content of the diet. And those data are retrievable in most places, particularly most developed countries in the world. Animal numbers, clearly. I mean, you will know whether beef, sheep, dairy populations in the state, in your region went up, down, or stayed stable. You will also know what their diet has been and roughly how much they ate and how much milk or meat they produced.
We all admit that the ruminants are the main problem with methane, but what about the monogastrics, like pigs and poultry And Homo sapiens, there's 8 billion of them,
Yes.
and they're all farting every day.
Yeah.
So have we got a metric on those guys?
There's some more than others, but yes. The point here, it's true, they all produce methane, but at a dismal amount compared to ruminants, okay? So pig and poultry and so on, they will produce enteric methane, i.e. flatulence, but it's dismal compared to what's belched out by a ruminant. Now their methane, the methane of monogastrics, is mainly associated with their manure decomposing. That's where the majority of their methane comes from. And the majority of their environmental footprint is more related to the feed that's grown for them. Oftentimes the feed grown for monogastric animals is the type of food that we could also eat directly.
Yes.
And that's where they are criticized, okay? So they all have their criticism coming from different angles. It's not so much the methane angle, it's more other angles like nitrogen and so on.
Can I interrupt, Robbie? Just to connect with that as well. When you show that circle in Southeast Asia, saying that there's a lot of people there, culturally those people won't eat beef or pork. When you say animal protein, are you considering chicken? Are you considering lamb? What you're saying that they would?
So it's kind of deceptive, okay? So when you look at India, for example, people say, well, they don't really eat bovine meat. That's true, they don't eat bovine meat, at least most of them don't eat bovine meat. But that doesn't mean they don't have cows. The United States has 9 million dairy cows. India has 300 million dairy cows and buffalo producing milk. And the productivity per animal is low, and once they fall out of production, they're not eaten. They're gone off, okay? They just walk around the streets of Delhi. And those of you who have been to India have seen that. There are tens of millions of those animals roaming around freely because they no longer produce milk, yet cannot be slaughtered. Now that circle there contains not just more people than the rest of the world, but also more ruminants than in the rest of the world. The two countries, India and Brazil, have more cattle in them than the rest of the world combined. So any kind of research that people like myself do must also have some relevance to places like that, or else we're not really all that impactful. Because I give you a lot of credit for the work you've done here in New Zealand, but I think everybody is clear you are a blip compared to overall global emissions. You do yours, we do ours, and so on. But the majority of emissions from the livestock sector globally occurs in developing countries.
Question down here, and then one.
The Australian microbiologist Walter Jen maintains that on a per hectare basis, one bioruminant, 1 unit of methane produced by one bioruminant is equivalent to 100 units of methane soaked up by these hydroxyl radicals. So do you agree with that? And won't that suggest that we're actually decreasing the warming effect through managed pasture grazing?
So I cannot opine at all to the numbers. I have no idea. I've never done that math. It depends on your locality as to how important of a sink your location is compared to the sources that you have. There are places like New Zealand where you have very rich soils, and where as a result the sequestration rate is not very high. And then you have other places where the soils are very poor, where the sequestration rate will be higher. What in general? All of that has profound impacts on soil sequestration, way above my pay rate. Okay? So I have not even touched that topic. I just know that these are factors affecting it. And I've talked to people here in New Zealand, people in high office. Some said soil carbon sequestration is huge and it offsets much of what ruminants produce. And others say, no, it's very, very little. And I haven't seen the data to give you a good answer.
Well, he's talking about the auto-ionization of transpired water from that grass. So we've got a completely different system to yours in the States, where you've got everything in a feed barn, feeding mainly starch rather than cellulose. So the methane profile is completely different. or the net methane profiles.
Yeah, that I'm not so hot about. I don't think that, I mean, particularly if it comes to water, I don't believe that that will have a big influence.
Can I throw to you, Richard? I'm conscious we've gone quite over time and we've got another group actually waiting to join us. So, Richard.
Very quickly, I think you did mention at the start that the Californian dairy farms methane profile is very much from the lagoons, the brown lagoons. Do you know roughly what the ratio is from earthen versus lagoons?
It's a little bit more from lagoons than it is from dairy. But our law says that we must reduce 40% methane from manure sources. So, but if you now use, let's say, a feed additive, like seaweed or P or so, if you use a feed additive and you reduce, let's say, 20% enteric methane, then you are allowed to count that achievement on the enteric side toward that 40% manure goal. I know that's clear as mud, but that's the way the law says it.
Was there a question down?
Well, I was just, yeah, I was interested in your comparison with the fact that the cows can eat the cellulose and utilise that feed, which can only be grown, which is grown over the, well, 2/3 of the supposedly good, the agricultural land that we can use. But in California, those dairy farms, they're existing on land that could be producing higher quality product that could be consumed directly by humans and save water and so that shouldn't the cows be removed from that country and crops of higher value that you suggested grown there rather than and have the cows free ranging like they do in New Zealand somewhere else if they can exist at all?
Yeah, so a good question. First of all, we don't have the marginal land needed to do what you're doing here. Our land is higher quality with respect to being arable, and we grow all these crops, as I said at the onset of my talk, such as cotton and almonds and citrus and all kinds of other things. And when you grow these crops, only a small percentage of the crop is eaten by people. So for example, if you grow cotton, you have cotton seeds. Excellent feed for cattle. Nobody else can eat it, they can. Excellent protein source. If you grow nuts, the almond hulls go to cattle production, okay? Excellent feed source. Citrus pulp does, almond hulls, cotton seeds. The vast majority of agricultural co-products and byproducts that normally would go to a landfill if ruminants weren't there, can, because of ruminants, be fed to them and are diverted from landfills to a source of human food production. And they end up producing milk that then becomes whatever we make of it. So the reason why we have so much dairy production in the state of California is because we have so much crop production, and our cows are a great recycler of everything that the crops leave behind. 50% of our cow diet is silage, the other 50% are co-products and byproducts. We're not feeding a bunch of grain or so to our dairy cows. They're eating a lot of all that stuff. If you come and visit our dairies, you'll be blown away what kind of stuff they eat. Kiwis that don't look so pretty, or almond hulls, cotton seeds, citrus pulps. I mean, anything that comes from these farms that's not going into a human mouth goes into a cow's mouth. So they need to be there.
Right, on that note, Frank, having enjoyed many of the fruits of California, including excellent margarita, thank you for giving us your vision from the Clear Centre, and I think you've delivered clarity in your conversation around the importance of incentives for our farmers. I do wonder what it's like to farm with 40 million people over the fence, and wonder whether that really encourages the farmers to be on the journey and over the fence, literally.
Don't try it out.
Well, some of our farmers, I feel, probably feel like they've got 40 million on their doorstep, and as an exporting nation, to some extent we do. Yes. But look, Frank, you provided clarity, you provided a great story, and thank you for taking the time to share it with us today. Please join me in thanking you.